Why did the laughter die so suddenly? It wasn't the kind of laughter that warmed a room. It was sharp, hollow, meant to cut. A group of tourists, emboldened by their numbers and the weight of anonymity, had gathered in front of the gates, their voices colliding in careless jeers. They thought the man in uniform wouldn't move. They thought the rifle slung across his chest was just a prop, his presence nothing more than ceremony. But then he shifted, just a fraction forward, just enough to turn silence into gravity. She saw it. From the edge of the crowd, standing apart where the shadows of the late afternoon stretched long across the cobblestones, she noticed what others missed. The slight tightening in his jaw, the deliberate weight in his step, the way the air seemed to hesitate around him before the crowd did. The jeering stopped because they suddenly remembered something ancient and simple. Dignity doesn't shout. It stands. It holds. And when it must, it steps forward. She hadn't expected the memory it stirred. Not here, not now. Her name wasn't known to them. To anyone watching, she was just another face. But beneath her coat was the quiet ache of years, missions that never made headlines, choices that carved lines deeper than age ever could. And as the rifle shifted, as the crowd hushed, her own chest tightened with something she hadn't let herself feel in years: recognition. Because she knew that stance. She knew what it cost to hold steady when others mocked, to be silent when provoked, to embody something heavier than flesh. And she knew why he had stepped forward. It wasn't for himself. It was for what he represented. But what did she represent now? The thought wouldn't leave her. Her hand twitched slightly at her side, a habit she hadn't broken since Afghanistan. She remembered waiting at checkpoints, the endless stillness broken only by the sound of distant rotors and the quiet hum of her own nerves. Back then, she had been the one who stood, who bore the silence while others doubted her, who shouldered the stare of men who never believed she belonged. And yet she had stayed. Stayed until the mission was over, until the weight of it all became too heavy to carry alone. Now, years later, here she was, just another face in a London crowd, watching a guard remind the world what discipline looked like. And all she could think was, when had she lost that? The guard didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. The crowd shifted uneasily, and like smoke dispersing, their laughter scattered into the wind. And that's when she felt it again, the echo. The sound of another silence, one from years earlier, a silence she had never spoken about. She had been on a rooftop then. The night was cold, the wind sharp against her cheek. Her rifle pressed against her shoulder, its weight both familiar and suffocating. Through the scope, the world narrowed into a single frame, a single choice. The radio crackled with instructions, but her finger never moved. She had hesitated, just long enough to change everything. And she had never forgiven herself for it. Now, standing at the edge of the crowd, watching a man step forward with a rifle he would never fire, she wondered if silence was ever enough. If dignity could carry the same weight as action. If maybe, just maybe, that was the lesson she had been running from all along. The guard returned to stillness. The crowd drifted, but she didn't move. Not yet. Her eyes stayed fixed, her breath caught in her chest, her thoughts spiraling somewhere far away. Because she wasn't here to watch a ceremony. She wasn't here for tourists or for guards. She was here because of something she hadn't told anyone, not even the few who still checked in on her. She had come to London for a reason, one she carried like a hidden scar beneath her coat. And the reason was waiting. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a vibration sharp enough to drag her back. She didn't look at it yet. She didn't need to. She knew who it was. The message would be brief, coded, the kind of text that seemed ordinary to anyone else. But to her, it meant movement. It meant choice. It meant that whatever shadow she had been avoiding was no longer willing to let her go. She took one last look at the guard, his stillness now a mirror. She envied him, envied the simplicity of his burden, duty in its purest form, stripped of doubt. Hers was messier. Hers was tangled in mistakes, in regrets, in debts unpaid. But maybe that's why she couldn't walk away, not this time. She turned from the gates, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone. The late afternoon light washed the city in gold, but it felt cold against her skin. The air smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Somewhere in the distance, bells tolled. Each sound seemed sharper now, heavier, as though the world was reminding her she was still alive, still capable, still needed. But needed for what? Her hand slipped into her pocket, fingers brushing against the phone. She pulled it free, glanced at the screen. 2 words, that was all. Tonight confirmed. She stared at the message, the crowd still bustling around her, tourists laughing again at something else, their voices rising like static. They didn't know. They never would. She slid the phone back into her pocket and kept walking, her pace steady, deliberate, her heart quickening with every step. Because tonight wasn't about them. It wasn't about the guard or the jeering or the silence that had followed. Tonight was about redemption. And she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Her breath caught again as she reached the edge of the square. A memory struck her, unexpected, sharp, a face. Not his, not the guard, someone else, a boy, no older than 20. His eyes had been wide that night, his voice trembling when he asked her if they'd make it back. She had told him yes. She had promised. But he hadn't. And she had never forgiven herself for that either. Now, years later, as London streets unfolded before her, she wondered if tonight would finally answer the question she had been avoiding since that rooftop, since that promise, since that silence. Could dignity ever be enough, or would she finally have to step forward? The rain began then, soft at first, barely more than a mist clinging to her hair and coat. She didn't pull up her hood, she welcomed it. Every drop a reminder that the world moved on whether she did or not. But tonight she had no choice. What was she walking toward, duty, or a trap of her own making? The city lights flickered against wet pavement, their reflections stretching like fractured ribbons beneath her boots. She walked without hurry, yet every step felt heavier, as though the cobblestones themselves carried memory. The rain had turned steady now, fine needles against her skin, the kind of drizzle that blurred faces and made strangers hurry past with umbrellas raised. But she didn't hurry. She never had. Her thoughts tugged at her in quiet flashes, dust storms, desert nights, the sharp crack of a rifle breaking silence. Every image bled into the next, unfinished, unresolved. She had thought distance might dull them. London was supposed to be a place to breathe, to disappear. But the message in her pocket had ended that illusion. Tonight confirmed. 2 words and the ghost stirred again. She cut left down a narrow street away from the crowds. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and oil, a city's secret breath. Her eyes caught every detail without conscious effort, the flicker of a street lamp struggling against the rain, the squeak of a window shutter in the wind, the shuffle of a man lighting a cigarette under an awning. Once she'd been trained to scan for threats, to measure angles, to notice what others overlooked. That habit never left. It lived in her bones now. And yet she hadn't touched a weapon in years, not since the rooftop, not since that silence. Her breath caught as the memory surfaced again. A command in her ear, urgent. A life in her scope, fragile. A finger that hesitated. She had told herself it was mercy. Later she wondered if it had been weakness. And when the consequences unfolded, when her hesitation became a story written in blood, she had buried the rifle, buried the uniform, buried herself. But now, the city wouldn't let her stay buried. She reached the cafe just as the rain began to ease. It was a small place, tucked into a row of shops that smelled faintly of coffee beans and old books. The sign above the door was chipped, its paint fading. The windows were fogged from inside. To anyone else it looked unremarkable, forgettable. That was the point. She stepped inside. The warmth hit her first, coffee, sugar, damp wool. A bell above the door chimed softly, a sound that seemed too delicate for what she knew this place was. The cafe was half empty, scattered with late evening customers hunched over laptops or sipping from mugs. Behind the counter, a young barista smiled faintly, indifferent, already turning back to the espresso machine. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her eyes found the back corner, the table that seemed permanently claimed by shadows, and there he was. He hadn't changed much. Maybe a little more gray at the temples, a little more weight in his posture, but his eyes were the same, sharp, calculating, always 2 steps ahead. He looked up as she approached, no smile, no greeting, just a nod. She slid into the seat across from him. "You came," he said simply. She didn't answer. Not yet. The rain was still dripping from her coat, and she found herself watching the droplets form tiny dark spots on the wooden floor. A strange calmness filled her chest, as though silence itself had followed her inside. Finally, she said, "You didn't leave me much choice." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "There's always a choice. You of all people should know that." Her jaw tightened. Always a choice. Yes, she knew that was the problem. The silence stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. The kind of silence two people shared when they'd seen too much together to need words. At last he leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "It's him." The words landed like stone. Her chest tightened. She had known, of course. Why else summon her after all this time? But hearing it out loud, hearing the weight of it, was different. She exhaled slowly. "I thought he disappeared." "He did, off the map, for years, but now he's resurfaced, tonight, and you're the only one who can get close." Her throat tightened against the rise of something she didn't want to name. Fear, anger, grief, all tangled. She forced her voice steady. "Why me?" "You already know the answer." And she did. That was the cruel part. He wasn't just a name, not just a shadow. He was tied to her past in ways no one else could understand. Tied to the rooftop, to the silence, to the boy who never made it back. The man across from her slid an envelope across the table. It looked ordinary, pale brown, edges worn. But her stomach tightened at the sight of it. She didn't touch it. "You don't have to open it now," he said quietly, "but you will." Her fingers twitched against the table's edge. The hum of the cafe pressed in, coffee grinders whirring, cups clinking, low murmurs of conversation. It all sounded distant, muffled, like she was underwater. "I'm not who I was," she said finally, her voice lower, almost a whisper. He studied her again. "Maybe, but you're the only one who knows him the way we need. The only one who understands what he'll do, and the only one who can stop him before tonight ends." The envelope sat between them like a heartbeat. She closed her eyes for a moment, the image of the rooftop flashing again. The scope, the command, the hesitation. The weight of a promise broken. The sound of silence. When she opened her eyes, the man was still watching her, waiting. And she knew. She would open the envelope. Not because she wanted to. Not because she believed she still belonged in this world, but because silence had cost her too much once before. Her hand moved, slow, steady, until her fingers brushed the edge of the envelope. The paper was rough, almost fragile. She pulled it closer, sliding it toward her. The man nodded once. No triumph, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement. As she stood, slipping the envelope into her coat, she caught sight of the barista again. Young, unaware, living in a world that had never asked him to choose between silence and action. For a brief moment, she envied him. Then she turned toward the door. The rain had stopped. The city glistened, washed clean. But inside her, nothing felt clean. Nothing felt simple. Because tonight was waiting, and with it, the past she had buried. She stepped out into the night, her breath fogging in the cool air. The street stretched ahead, endless, lit by lamps that glowed against the wet stone. She walked with purpose now, though her chest was tight, her mind a storm. Every sound seemed louder, the distant rush of traffic, the whisper of footsteps behind her, the faint call of a siren somewhere far away. London lived on, indifferent, while her world narrowed again to a single frame. She touched the envelope in her coat pocket. It felt heavier than it should have, heavier than a rifle, heavier than silence. And as she moved into the night, the question echoed in her mind. Was she stepping forward now out of strength or out of guilt? Why was her hand trembling when she hadn't even opened the envelope yet? The city stretched before her like a maze of stone and light, but all she could feel was the thin paper in her coat pocket. It pressed against her side with every step, reminding her of the choice she hadn't fully admitted she'd already made. She would open it. She would look. She would face what she'd buried. But not yet. Not in the open, not with strangers' voices echoing against wet walls. She needed quiet. The rain had thinned to mist, clinging to her hair, turning the streetlights into blurred halos. She pulled her coat tighter and crossed the square, her boots clicking against the pavement. The city carried on, cabs splashing through puddles, couples laughing under umbrellas, the occasional bark of a street vendor hawking roasted chestnuts. Life was ordinary, almost insultingly so. She found herself glancing at faces, strangers with no idea of the weight she carried, no idea that tonight was different. Their eyes slid past her, unbothered, uninterested. For a moment she envied them their ignorance. Then she remembered she used to be them once, before the desert, before the rooftop, before silence rewrote her life. She ducked into a narrow alley, the kind most Londoners avoided. Here, the city's noise dimmed. The air smelled of damp brick and faint gasoline. A broken lamp flickered above, casting uneven shadows along the walls. She leaned against the cool stone, her breath steadying, and finally drew out the envelope. Her fingers hesitated at the seal. Strange, she thought, how something so thin could weigh more than years of memory. With a slow breath, she tore it open. Inside were photographs, black and white, grainy, printed on cheap paper. She held the first one closer, the street lamp's weak light falling across the image. A face stared back at her, older, harder, but unmistakable. Him. Her stomach knotted. The second photo showed a location, a warehouse near the river if she wasn't mistaken, abandoned on the outside, but the faint glow of windows told a different story. The third photo was time-stamped, 2300 hours, tonight. And beneath the photos, a single note in handwriting she recognized immediately. It was clipped, almost surgical. Finish it. Her jaw tightened. The paper crumpled slightly under her grip. Finish it, as though it were that simple, as though years of regret, hesitation, and loss could be undone with a single act. She slid the photos back into the envelope, tucking it into her coat. But the face lingered in her mind. His face. She remembered it not from a photograph, but from a night under desert skis, where the stars burned like shards of glass above them. He had been her commanding officer once. Charismatic, sharp, a man others followed without question. But beneath the surface there had been something else. Ambition twisted too far, choices made in shadows. She had seen it. She had almost spoken. And then came the rooftop, the hesitation, the silence that cost a boy his life. Her throat ached at the memory. She pushed off the wall, forcing herself to move. The warehouse, the face, tonight. Her boots echoed in the alley, her breath forming clouds in the cool night air. Every step carried her closer, not just to the mission, but to the past she had been running from. She had told herself she left because she was finished with war. But maybe war hadn't finished with her. She reached the river just as the city seemed to grow quieter, the water black and restless under the glow of scattered lights. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows faintly lit, its exterior scarred with rust and neglect. From the outside it looked like a carcass of industry, long abandoned. But she knew better. She stopped at the edge of the street, her eyes scanning the perimeter. Old habits returned, counting exits, measuring sightlines, knotting shadows that lingered too long. She spotted two men near the loading bay, smoking, their posture too rigid for simple loitering. Guards. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, from memory. She slipped into the cover of a stairwell across the street, her eyes fixed on the warehouse. The photographs had said enough. He was inside. After years of silence, after vanishing into the dark, he was here, and she was supposed to end it. But what did end it even mean? Her hands tightened around the edge of her coat. She didn't have her rifle. She hadn't touched one in years. She hadn't wanted to. And yet she felt the ghost of it now, the cold steel against her cheek, the weight against her shoulder. Her fingers twitched unconsciously, the old muscle memory clawing its way back. Her breath came slower, steadier. She hadn't realized she was preparing until she was already halfway there. A voice cracked across her memory. Not tonight, a different night, a boy's voice. "Do you think we'll make it back?" She had promised, she had said yes, and then silence had answered for her. Her jaw clenched. She pulled the envelope free again, staring once more at his face. The man who had led them into that night. The man who had vanished when it all collapsed. The man who had left her with a silence too heavy to carry. And now she had been told to finish it. Her chest rose and fell, her pulse steady in her ears. The city felt distant, blurred. Only the warehouse was real now, only the choice waiting inside. A shout rang faintly near the loading bay, laughter, harsh and careless. The two guards flicked their cigarettes away, stepping into the glow of a security light. She watched their shadows stretch across the wet concrete. Ordinary men. Maybe they didn't even know who they were protecting. Maybe they were just following orders like she once had. Her breath caught. For a moment she thought about turning back, walking away, letting silence have her again. But then she remembered the guard earlier, the rifle shift, the step forward. Sometimes silence wasn't enough. She moved. Crossing the street, she kept to the shadows, her steps quiet against the damp pavement. The rain had left the ground slick, muffling her movement. She hugged the wall of the warehouse, her eyes flicking upward to the rows of windows. A faint glow seeped from one near the top. That's where he would be. She didn't know how she knew, she just did. Her fingers brushed the cold steel of the service door. Locked, of course. She scanned the wall, spotting a rusted fire escape leading upward. It groaned under her weight as she climbed, every creak like a heartbeat too loud. But the guards below didn't notice. Their laughter covered her. She reached the second floor, slipping through a window half-cracked with broken glass. Inside, the air was thick with dust and faint machinery oil. The silence was heavier here, broken only by the hum of distant voices. She crouched, moving slowly across the shadows, every step deliberate. And then she heard it. His voice. It carried faintly down the hallway, muffled but unmistakable. Older now, rougher, but still threaded with that same command that once drew people to follow. Her chest tightened. The past was no longer a memory, it was alive, waiting just ahead. She pressed against the wall, her breath slow, her pulse hammering. The rooftop flashed again, the scope, the command, the hesitation. She whispered under her breath, almost to herself, "Not this time." Her hand brushed the edge of the envelope once more. Finish it. And as she stepped forward, the silence she carried all these years shifted. For the first time, it felt like something she could break. How do you walk toward the man who shattered everything you believed in? The corridor stretched before her, dim light spilling from half-broken bulbs overhead. Dust swirled in the stale air with every step she took, her boots whispering against the concrete. Somewhere ahead, his voice drifted, low, commanding, as though he still believed people would listen, as though nothing had changed. She paused at the corner, pressing her shoulder to the cold wall. Her hand brushed instinctively against her coat where the envelope lay hidden, though she no longer needed to look inside. She knew his face, knew it too well. She closed her eyes for a second, forcing her breath steady. The silence inside her chest felt like a coiled spring, ready to break. Why now, after all these years, why had he resurfaced? Why tonight? Her mind answered before her heart could, because unfinished things never stay buried. She moved again, slow, careful. Every sound around her sharpened, the faint hum of a generator, the drip of water from a cracked pipe, the scrape of a chair against the floor somewhere deeper inside. She counted 2 voices now, maybe 3, but his rose above them. It always did. And then memory pulled her back. She was sitting at a camp table, dust clinging to her uniform, the heat pressing like a hand on her chest. He had leaned over a map, his finger tapping coordinates with confidence that silenced the doubts of everyone around. His words had been sharp, convincing, the kind that left no room for hesitation. She remembered watching him, young but already wary, wondering if anyone else noticed the cracks in his certainty. Later she realized they hadn't, or maybe they hadn't wanted to. The rooftop had proven it. She shook the thought away. Not now. She couldn't drown in memory when reality was waiting steps ahead. She eased closer to the sound of voices, crouching at the edge of a doorway. Through a crack in the wood she glimpsed movement. A figure packing, taller, broader now, but his stance was unmistakable. Even after all these years, he carried himself like a man who believed the world still belonged to him. Her chest tightened. She wanted to look away, she wanted to turn back, but she didn't, not this time. Another man spoke, his words clipped, nervous. She couldn't make them out entirely, but the tone was enough questions, doubt. The packing man snapped back with force, silencing him. She could almost see it, the same authority, the same control. Nothing had changed. Except her. She drew back from the door, pressing her hand against her forehead. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear, but from the storm inside her. Anger, grief, guilt, all fighting for space. She whispered under her breath, barely audible, "You don't get to walk away this time." But even as she said it, a question gnawed at her. What would she do when the moment came? Could she pull the trigger she hadn't before? Could she finish it? Or would silence claim her again? The thought shook her, but she moved anyway. She had to. She crept further along the corridor, searching for another entry. A stairwell led upward, the steps groaning under her weight. She winced but kept climbing. At the top, she found a narrow balcony overlooking the warehouse floor. From here, the scene unfolded below, crates stacked high, machinery rusting in silence, and in the center, a small cluster of men around a table. And him. She froze, gripping the railing, her breath catching in her throat. The years had changed him. Lines cut deeper into his face, hair flecked with gray, but the eyes were the same. Sharp, cold, certain. She felt them even from a distance. The silence in her chest grew heavier. He leaned over the table, pointing at papers spread out. Maps, diagrams, photographs she couldn't see clearly. The men around him nodded, their postures tense, obedient. Just like before, always obedient. Her hands tightened on the railing until her knuckles ached. She thought of the boy again, the one who had asked if they'd make it back. She thought of her promise, her lie. She thought of the rooftop, of the moment her finger hesitated, of the silence that answered instead of the shot. And she thought of the cost. Her eyes burned, but she didn't blink, not yet. For a long moment she just stood there, watching him, letting the memories claw at her until her chest felt raw. Then slowly, deliberately, she let the silence shift inside her. No longer something that held her back, something that steadied her. Because this time, she wasn't here to hesitate. She pulled back from the balcony, crouching low, scanning for a path closer. A staircase wound down to the warehouse floor, shadows cloaking its edges. She moved carefully, each step measured, her breath shallow. Halfway down, she stopped. A voice echoed, louder now, his, clear, commanding. She couldn't make out every word, but the fragments chilled her. Plans, movements, something set for tomorrow, maybe even tonight. Something that would spread beyond this warehouse. Her grip on the railing tightened. This wasn't just about the past anymore. Her foot shifted on the step and the metal groaned. She froze, her breath caught. One of the men below turned his head, scanning the shadows. She pressed back against the wall, still silent. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Seconds stretched like hours. Then the man turned away, reassured by the darkness. She exhaled slowly, forcing her body to move again. Down the last steps, into the cover of crates stacked along the wall. Closer now. Close enough to hear fragments of his voice more clearly. Control the narrative. Not governments, not armies, us. Her chest tightened again. The same arrogance. The the same belief that power belonged only to those willing to seize it. She crouched behind the crates, her breath shallow. He was only steps away now. Years of silence, regret, and guilt narrowed into this moment. Her hand brushed her coat again. She hadn't brought a rifle. She hadn't needed one. But in her pocket, something else waited, small, metallic, a weight she hadn't carried in years. Insurance, she had told herself when she took it, but now it felt inevitable. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat. She saw the rooftop, the boy, the silence. And when she opened them again, she whispered, quiet, certain. Not again. What does silence sound like when it finally decides to speak? She felt the weight of it pressing inside her chest as she rose from the shadows, every movement deliberate, every breath measured. The men at the table hadn't noticed her yet, their attention bound to the one voice that had held them captive for years. His voice. The same tone that once commanded her, the same certainty that once fooled her into believing they were on the right side of everything. But not anymore. Her boots touched the concrete floor without a sound, each step pulling her closer, each heartbeat tightening the coil inside her. She could see the map now, spread wide on the table beneath the dim lights, lines and marks, circles and arrows pointing to places she recognized. Not just this city, beyond. It was never small with him. It was never enough. Her throat ached, but her voice stayed inside. Not yet, not until she wanted it. She moved between crates, sliding from shadow to shadow, closer and closer until only 10 steps separated them. The men around him leaned in, nodding, their pens scratching notes. None of them looked up. None of them realized how close she was. Until he did. It was uncanny, the way he always seemed to sense when someone was watching. He froze mid-sentence, his hand hovering over the map. His head turned slightly, eyes narrowing. Slowly his gaze lifted, scanning the shadows. And then their eyes met. Her breath caught the silence roaring inside her ears. For a heartbeat, time fractured. She saw him as he was now, older, sharper, dangerous still. And she saw him as he had been then, standing on the rooftop, issuing orders that cost lives, watching her hesitate, watching her fail. His mouth curved into something almost like a smile, not surprise, recognition. Well, he said, his voice cutting through the warehouse, smooth and cold. It seems the ghost finally decided to walk. The other men turned, startled, their hands twitching toward weapons. But he raised a hand, stopping them, his eyes never leaving hers. She stepped forward out of the shadows, every muscle taut, every breath deliberate. You talk too much, she said, her voice steady though her chest shook. Just like always. A flicker crossed his face, amusement perhaps or something darker, and you still arrived too late. Her fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to shout, to accuse, to spill the truth of every scar he had left behind. But the silence inside her held firm, steadying her, sharpening her. Words wouldn't undo the past. Still they pressed against her lips. You left them, she said, her voice lower now, almost breaking. You left us all, and you called it strategy. The men around him shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. But he didn't flinch. His eyes locked on hers, cold, unwavering. They were pawns, he said, no hesitation, no shame. Expendable, you of all people should understand. Survival isn't for the weak. It's for the ones willing to sacrifice what others can't. Her chest burned, fury rising like fire through her veins. The boy's face flashed in her mind. The rooftop, the silence. Her voice came sharper this time. You don't get to decide who's expendable. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. Of course I do, someone has to. And you, his eyes narrowed and his voice dropped, almost intimate. You had your chance. You had me in your sights once, and you couldn't do it. The words sliced through her, precise and merciless. She felt her breath falter just for a second, just enough for memory to strike. Her finger on the trigger, the hesitation, the silence that followed. Her hands trembled, but she didn't back down. She stepped closer, one slow stride at a time, until she stood at the edge of the table. The men shifted uneasily, glancing at him for instruction. Still, he didn't raise a hand. He just watched her, eyes calculating, measuring. "You think you've won because you survived," she said, her voice low, controlled. "But surviving isn't winning, it's running." He tilted his head, studying her. For the first time, the smile slipped. She drew in a breath, steadying herself, feeling the silence inside her shift again. It wasn't guilt now. It wasn't hesitation. It was resolve. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket. She didn't pull the weapon out yet, but she let him see the movement. Let him know. The men around him tensed instantly, reaching for their own. But his hand shot up again, stopping them. His eyes never left hers. "Interesting," he murmured. So the silence finally found a voice. She leaned forward slightly, her voice sharp as glass. "No," the silence finally found its purpose. The air between them thickened, charged. Every second stretched, fragile, breakable. One wrong move, one word, and it would all shatter. She could feel the weight of the years pressing between them. The betrayal, the hesitation, the lives lost. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the moment she had been walking toward since the rooftop. Her silence had ended. Now it was time to decide what came next. What happens when the silence inside one person forces everyone else to hear their own? The warehouse seemed smaller now, the air heavier. The maps on the table blurred at the edges of her vision, lines and circles bleeding together as her focus narrowed on him, just him. Every movement he made was deliberate, controlled, but for the first time she caught something else in his eyes. Not fear, not hesitation, something quieter, awareness. She knew that look. He had measured threats his whole life, but he had never measured her this way before. The men at the table shifted, restless. Their hands hovered near weapons, but none dared draw first. His raised hand still held them in check. A fragile order bound them, one that could fracture with the smallest word. And in that silence she realized this wasn't just about her and him anymore. They were watching. They were listening. Every second stretched was an invitation for them to choose, his voice or hers. Her chest rose slowly, the weight of it threatening to break her ribs. "You taught them wrong," she said, her voice low but steady. "You told them sacrifice was strength, but sacrifice isn't throwing people away. It's carrying them when no one else will." The words surprised even her. She hadn't planned them. They slipped from the place she had buried for years, the place she avoided because it hurt too much. And now it was out in the open. One of the younger men at the table, barely more than a boy, really flinched. His jaw tightened, his eyes flickered between her and him. She saw it, the crack, the uncertainty. He noticed it too. His hand dropped lower, flat on the table, fingers curling slightly. His voice cut across the space like a blade. "Do not mistake weakness for wisdom." His words lashed at her, but they lashed at the boy too. The younger man's face stiffened, torn between the command he'd always obeyed and the truth trembling in her voice. She stepped closer, her hand still resting near her coat pocket, the weight of the weapon pressing against her skin. Not a threat, a reminder. Her voice softened, but the weight behind it deepened. "You told me once that silence was loyalty, that staying quiet meant strength, but silence isn't strength, it's fear, and I carried that fear for years." She swallowed, the words catching, breaking. Not anymore. Something shifted, not loud, not dramatic, just a breath, a stillness. The boy lowered his hand from his holster. A ripple passed through the room. He saw it. His eyes snapped to the boy, his jaw tightening. "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't mistake her hesitation for truth. She's nothing but failure dressed in regret." The words cut, deep and merciless. They were meant to. He knew exactly where to strike. But this time she didn't bleed. Her silence held. Her body didn't tremble. She met his gaze without breaking, her voice low, steady, dangerous in its calm. "You mistake regret for weakness, but regret is what keeps me human, and it's what keeps me from becoming you." For the first time he faltered. Just a flicker, barely a breath, but she saw it. The shadow that crossed his face, quick as lightning. The men saw it too. The silence thickened, pressing against every wall, every chest, every thought. Choices hung in the air, waiting to fall. Then he straightened, his hand slamming down on the table, rattling the maps, shattering the stillness. His voice rose, sharp and commanding, the voice that once bent them all to his will. "She is nothing," he barked. "Do you hear me? Nothing, a shadow of hesitation, a ghost of failure, and I will not." The boy spoke, quietly, barely audible at first, but it cut sharper than a shout. "Then why are you afraid of her?" The words dropped like stone into water, sending ripples through every man at the table. He froze just for a second, his hand clenched tighter on the table's edge, his eyes flickered with fire. But the silence in the room had shifted. It no longer belonged to him. She felt it. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone inside her silence. It had spread, wrapping the room, pulling others into its weight. Her breath steadied, her voice followed. "You wanted me to stay quiet so no one would ever question you, but I learned something. Sometimes silence doesn't protect, sometimes it betrays, and sometimes—" She took a step closer, her eyes locked on his. "Sometimes silence ends, and when it does, everyone finally hears what they've been trying to ignore." The boy's hand dropped fully from his weapon. Another man shifted uneasily. The ripple spread further. And he knew it, she saw it in his face. The room wasn't his anymore. His voice dropped lower, colder, every syllable sharpened. "Do you think you've won? Do you think this little performance changes what's coming? I built this. I built them. They are mine." Her voice broke through, soft but unwavering. "No, they were never yours. You only borrowed their silence." For the first time he had no words. His mouth closed, his jaw tight. The silence swallowed him whole. She breathed slow and heavy, her hand slipping from her pocket. Not drawing, not threatening, just letting the weight of it remain where it was. The men around the table shifted again, restless, uncertain. No one moved first. But she had already moved enough. Her silence had fractured his. And for the first time in years, she wasn't the one trembling. Why did everyone suddenly hold their breath, as if the air itself feared what would happen next? The warehouse felt alive now, not with movement, not with life, but with tension so thick it pressed against skin and bone. Every shadow was heavier, every footstep sharper. She could hear it, the quiet hum of anticipation, the unspoken question waiting for an answer. Who would move first? He stood rigid at the table, the men around him frozen. He had always commanded obedience, demanded it. But now the weight of his past decisions bore down on them all, and for the first time, obedience faltered. Her eyes swept across the room, noting every hesitation. The boy she had glimpsed before, the one she remembered from the past, now looked her way. Not for guidance, not for permission, but for understanding. And in that glance she saw his conflict, his fear, his moral compass teetering on the edge of choice. She stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Her boots whispered against the concrete floor, a soft reminder of presence, of life, of intent. Her hands remained at her sides, the envelope still tucked away, the weight of years pressing against her chest. "Listen," she said, her voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade tempered in fire. "This doesn't have to end like the last time. You can choose differently." The words rippled through the room, a pause, a breath held, then a murmur, soft, hesitant. One man shifted his weight, another's hand twitched toward his holster, then dropped. She saw it, the cracks forming. Loyalties built on fear and command were splintering, and with each step she felt the truth of her own power. Silence had its weight, but her voice had consequences. He snapped his head toward her, his expression hardening. "Do not presume to lecture me." Her gaze held his, steady, unyielding. "I am not lecturing, I am reminding that people have lives beyond your command, beyond your control, beyond your ego." For a brief second she saw him falter, not completely, not entirely, but the shadow of doubt flickered. And that was enough. She let herself exhale, slow and controlled. The warehouse seemed to tilt slightly, the air vibrating with uncertainty. The men around him glanced at one another, their eyes darting from him to her, from loyalty to conscience. The choice lay before them. One of the men, the youngest, stepped back shaking, his voice barely audible. Maybe she's right. A ripple went through the others, small, almost imperceptible but undeniable. He slammed a fist on the table, the sound reverberating, demanding attention, demanding submission. Do not let her words sway you. Do not. But the seed had been planted. She moved closer until she stood across from him, face to face. Years of memory clashed in that gaze, the rooftop, the boy, the silence, the loss. And now the present, a choice, immediate and inescapable. You built them to follow, she said quietly, letting the weight of her voice sink. But following blindly isn't strength, and it's not loyalty, it's fear, and fear dies when someone finally speaks. The men around him shifted again. One knelt slightly, hesitating, conflicted. Another stepped back entirely, eyes wide, trembling. He barked at them, sharp, commanding, but the words fell into the space between her voice and the room's new tension. They landed like stones in water, and ripples cannot be stopped. Her chest rose and fell. She could feel her heart hammering, not from fear but from the surge of purpose. She had walked through years of silence, carried its weight in every step, and now it fueled her. Every memory, every regret, every loss coalesced into a single, unwavering resolve. You can follow him, she said softly, her eyes scanning the hesitant faces. Or you can stand. Stand for yourself. Stand for what's right. Stand because it matters more than fear. The silence pressed in again, thick, heavy, yet malleable now. She could almost taste the tension, metallic and bitter, on her tongue. And then, one by one, they moved. Not aggressively, not violently, but with intent. The boy stepped forward, his hand raised slightly, not toward her but away from him. I choose to stand. A ripple followed. Another man, then another, until the balance of the room shifted. Fear had no purchase here anymore. He turned toward her, eyes narrowing. Rage flickered across his face, sharp and raw. You think this changes anything? She shook her head slowly. I don't think I know. Her voice carried across the warehouse, soft but impossible to ignore. You can't control everything, and you can't rewrite the past, but you can choose not to destroy more in the process. He froze just for a fraction of a second. In that fraction, the past and present collided. She could see the weight of the rooftop, the choices he had made, the lives lost, reflected in the faint flicker in his eyes. For the first time, he looked uncertain. She stepped closer, slowly, letting her presence fill the space. Every man who had hesitated now looked to her, drawn not by command but by moral gravity. You built a world where silence spoke louder than truth, she continued. But truth doesn't need noise. It doesn't need threats. It only needs courage. The warehouse fell into a fragile stillness. Even the hum of machinery faded, leaving only the collective breathing of the men, the tension hanging like a living thing between them. He opened his mouth, started to speak, but she cut him off. No, not yet, you listen. And for what felt like the longest time, he did. She didn't raise a weapon. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply stood, a figure of controlled force and quiet moral certainty, letting the truth of her presence speak louder than any command he could issue. The first man stepped fully away from the table, defiance in his posture. Another followed. One by one, the men shifted their allegiance, not to her exactly, but to the idea she embodied: courage, conscience, and the power to act without fear. He backed against the table, his hands gripping its edge, realizing that control was slipping. Not through violence, not through threats, but through something he had always underestimated: integrity. And in that moment, she saw it. The balance of power had changed. The fear he wielded like a weapon no longer held sway. The envelope in her pocket felt heavier now, not with threat but with purpose. She had walked through silence for years, and now it had delivered her here. The warehouse was quiet but alive, alive with possibility, alive with the weight of choice. And she understood something that only comes with surviving everything you thought could destroy you. Courage isn't loud. It isn't showy. It doesn't demand attention. It is measured. It is deliberate. And it speaks through action, not noise. Her hand rested against her coat, the weapon there but unnecessary. The men around him were silent, waiting. The boy's eyes met hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them. She stepped forward again, not aggressively, but with certainty, letting her presence claim the space that had been controlled by fear for far too long. He knew it, and she knew that tonight the silence would end completely. How do you measure victory when no one dies, yet everyone changes? The warehouse was silent now, not the quiet that hides behind fear or obedience, not the suffocating quiet of hesitation. This was different, charged, electric, full of the weight of choices made and paths diverged. He stood at the table, rigid, a man who had spent his life bending others to his will, and yet now he could not move a single soul. The men around him had stepped back, literally and figuratively, breaking the invisible chains he had forged over them. His authority, so carefully built, had crumbled without a single shot fired. She took a deep breath, letting the tension in her chest ease, the silent weight she had carried for years finally shifting, dispersing into the room. The envelope in her coat pocket felt lighter now, like a burden returned to its proper place. She had walked through years of silence, regret, and moral questioning, and now that journey had reached its necessary conclusion. The boy, the one who had been closest to choosing violence in the past, the one who had flinched and doubted, stepped forward. His voice was quiet but firm. "She's right. All of this, it doesn't have to be your way." Another man followed, nodding, eyes clear, shoulders straightening. The ripple spread. Small, deliberate movements, gestures of independence. Each one a testament to the idea she had carried in her silence. Courage doesn't roar, it persists. It acts. He watched them, incredulous, his jaw tight. For the first time, the fear and respect he once commanded dissolved into disbelief. His world, the one he had shaped through control, manipulation, and intimidation, was now open, fractured by one person who refused to be silent. And that person stood in front of him, poised, composed, unwavering. Her chest rose slowly as her breath steadied. Every step, every choice, every moment of restraint had led to this. Her voice broke the silence, low and deliberate. "You've spent your life defining strength as control. You taught them that obedience was loyalty. You built your empire on fear. But it's not fear that binds people, it's trust, and respect, and integrity." The men around him listened, not because she commanded them, but because she had earned the right to be heard. The difference was palpable. The tension, once suffocating, now carried clarity. He looked at her, searching for weakness, searching for hesitation. There was none. His lips parted as if to speak, but the words faltered. She let the pause stretch, thick and deliberate. "Sometimes," she said softly, almost a whisper, "dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." He recoiled slightly, not from fear of her weapon, which remained tucked at her side, but from the force of her presence, the weight of the truth she carried. The men at the table shifted, finally free from the gravity of his authority, realizing they had choices. And in that realization there was freedom. She stepped forward, closer to the edge of the table, but not threatening, not aggressive. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in every expression: fear, relief, awe, hesitation. Each reflected her own journey, the cost of silence, the burden of conscience, the ultimate reward of action. The boy approached cautiously. "What now?" he asked. His voice trembled slightly, but it carried hope. She looked at him, letting her expression soften. "Now," she said, "we decide what matters, not fear, not control, but what's right together." And in that moment, the room seemed to exhale. The air shifted. The tension evaporated, replaced by the quiet strength that comes from integrity standing tall against corruption and ego. She turned her attention to him, the man who had once held power like a weapon. He looked smaller now, not physically, but morally. Stripped of the illusion that obedience could be forced, stripped of the confidence that fear could command loyalty, stripped of the certainty that control equated to victory. And still he said nothing, because sometimes silence is the loudest answer. She exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle, letting the years of regret, hesitation, and loss finally release. Her hand brushed the envelope in her coat one last time, a symbol of the journey she had endured and the choices she had made. It was no longer a burden. It was a reminder of resilience, of the power that comes not from the trigger, but from the mind and heart steady in conviction. Outside, the rain had stopped. The mist clung to the city, shimmering under the streetlights. The world felt distant yet intimate. She imagined the boy she had saved long ago, the lives she had touched, the moments she had nearly lost. And she realized this was victory, not of conquest, not of dominance, but of moral clarity. The men around him began to disperse slowly, quietly. No fanfare, no declarations, just the subtle, deliberate movement of individuals reclaiming agency for themselves. She watched them leave, her eyes lingering on the boy, who offered a tentative nod. She nodded back, no words were necessary. Finally, she turned her attention to the man at the table. He remained standing, rigid, defeated in a way that was not visible but unmistakably real. She felt a pang, not of triumph but of understanding. Years of power, ambition, and arrogance could not withstand the truth held by someone who had endured the weight of conscience. She stepped past him, walking toward the exit. The warehouse doors groaned as she opened them, the night air spilling inside. Mist swirled around her boots, the city stretching out beyond in quiet, luminous beauty. Every step felt lighter than the last. She had faced the past, confronted the present, and reclaimed her voice. And she knew, finally, that silence had its place, but action, deliberate and principled, defined her. Outside, the streets were empty, yet alive. The world went on, unaware of the quiet revolution that had just unfolded within that warehouse. But she did not need recognition. She never had. The understanding she carried in her heart was enough. She paused for a moment, letting the night settle around her. The mist hung like memory in the air, and as she looked up at the faintly glowing sky, she whispered softly, almost to herself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. A final gust of wind passed through the city, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and renewal. She inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of years lift, replaced with the steady pulse of purpose and moral certainty. And then silence. Not the suffocating silence of fear or hesitation, but a quiet that spoke of resolution, of courage, of endurance. She turned away from the warehouse, walking into the misty streets, alone but not lonely. The world was waiting, vast and uncertain, but she had found her place within it, not as a soldier defined by fear, not as a survivor burdened by regret, but as someone whose silence had finally acted, whose voice had finally mattered. And for the first time in years, she felt unshakable, whole, and free.